There are places in the world that seem to carry a resonance far deeper than stones, sand, or time. Abydos is one of those places. Situated on the west bank of the Nile, at the edge of the desert, it was never merely a settlement, nor just another city in the chain of Egypt's ancient centers. It was the beating spiritual heart of the Egyptian imagination, a place where myth and earth, heaven and death, were woven together in a single sacred geography. To the ancient Egyptians, Abydos was not just a location, it was a threshold, a gate. For it was here, in this desert landscape, that they believed the body of Osiris, Lord of the underworld and God of resurrection, was buried. And if the God of rebirth had his tomb here, then Abydos became nothing less than the meeting point of worlds, the visible and invisible, the mortal and the eternal. This belief made Abydos the holiest pilgrimage site of the ancient world. Just as Muslims today journey to Mecca, so too Egyptians, from commoners to kings, traveled to Abydos to pay homage to Osiris. Some came to participate in grand processions where the story of the god's murder, dismemberment, and resurrection was ritually reenacted. Others came to inscribe their names on temple walls, to anchor their souls to the sacred energy of the place, believing that even the mere presence of their names at Abydos would secure them a place in eternity. Abydos was not simply a site of ritual, it was a cosmic insurance, a guarantee that the soul would be guided across the threshold of death into the light of rebirth. It is in this city of gods and kings, pilgrims and priests, that a mystery was unearthed. Beneath the sands near the sacred temple complex of Osiris, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected. Great wooden boats, buried in long pits, preserved by the desert for millennia. These were not ordinary boats, nor simple offerings. They were massive, some over 20 meters long, carefully constructed, laid to rest as if awaiting a journey not across the Nile, but across the river of death itself. Why would pharaohs build boats that were never meant to sail the earthly waters? Why place them in the sand, hidden from sight, yet destined to outlast empires? The answer lies in the Egyptian vision of existence itself. For them, life was not linear, ending in darkness. Life was cyclical, eternal, bound to rhythms of death and rebirth mirrored in the rising and setting of the sun, the flooding and retreating of the Nile, the growing and withering of the crops. Existence was a great river, and death was simply another bend in its course. To cross that bend, one needed a vessel, not of clay nor of flesh, but of divine craftsmanship. The boat buried in the sand of Abydos was a vehicle for the soul, a bridge from the world of the seen into the world of the unseen. Abydos, then, was more than sacred geography. It was a spiritual technology. The city itself was a gate, and the buried boats were its keys. Together they formed a map of eternity, the temple where Osiris rose, the desert that opened into the invisible realm, and the vessels that awaited the departed king to carry him into the heart of the cosmos. The resonance of Abydos reaches further than archaeology, further than myth. For even now, to stand before its ruined temples and desert pits is to feel a vibration of something greater than stone and sand. It is to sense the same intuition that guided the ancients, that life does not end but transforms, that death is not a final silence, but a passage into another current of being. This is why Abydos has haunted the dreams of seekers for millennia. It was not only a city of the dead, it was a city of becoming, a place where one prepared to rise again. And so, when we speak of Abydos as the gate between worlds, we are not speaking metaphorically. For the Egyptians, this was literal. The pharaoh did not merely rule Egypt. He was destined to sail the cosmic river, to journey with Osiris, to become part of the eternal cycle of sun and stars. His buried boats were the proof. His journey was not a myth, but a destiny. For us, Abydos remains a whisper from the sands, a reminder that the human soul has always longed for more than survival. It has longed for passage, a vessel that could carry us across the great unknown, not as victims of fate, but as voyagers of eternity. This is the stage upon which our story begins. A desert city where gods once walked, where kings prepared for journeys beyond death, and where boats slumbered in silence for 4,000 years, waiting to be rediscovered. Abydos, the gate between worlds, and the key to the greatest mystery of all, resurrection. To understand Abydos, one must first understand Osiris. In Egyptian myth, Osiris was more than a god. He was the very embodiment of death, resurrection, and eternal order. He was the king who had once ruled Egypt in a golden age, betrayed and slain by his brother Set, dismembered and scattered across the land. His wife Isis, through devotion and magic, gathered his body, restored his form, and brought him back to life, long enough for him to father Horus, the avenger who would reclaim the throne. Osiris himself, though never again to walk the earth, descended into the underworld, becoming its eternal ruler, not as a tyrant of shadows, but as a guide of souls, the promise that life continues beyond the veil. It was in Abydos that this myth crystallized into living ritual. Here Egyptians believed was the burial place of Osiris, the axis where the divine story intersected with the geography of Earth. To journey to Abydos was to journey into the myth itself. Pilgrims came not only to honor the god, but to participate in his cycle of death and renewal. They joined processions where the story was reenacted in sacred drama: the mourning of Isis, the search for the god's scattered limbs, the resurrection, and the triumph of order over chaos. To stand in Abydos was to step into eternity, to feel oneself woven into the fabric of a story older than kings. For the pharaohs, Abydos held an even greater weight. To rule Egypt was to mirror the cosmic order itself, to become the living Horus, the son of Osiris. Yet beyond the throne, beyond the monuments and wars, lay a greater destiny: to follow Osiris in death and resurrection. By associating themselves with Abydos, by building monuments and burying boats in its sands, pharaohs bound themselves to this divine cycle. Their afterlife was not a vague hope. It was a structured journey, a passage across realms, anchored in the myth of Osiris and sanctified in the soil of Abydos. The boat was central to this vision. To the Egyptians, existence was a river, not only because of the Nile, the artery of their civilization, but because of the deeper intuition that life itself flows. The sun god Ra crossed the sky each day in his solar bark, descending at dusk into the underworld, where he battled serpents and chaos, only to rise again with dawn. The pharaoh, as son of Ra and Osiris alike, was destined to repeat this cosmic voyage. His boat, buried in the sands of Abydos, was a reflection of Ra's eternal vessel, a preparation to join the sun in its endless cycle of death and rebirth. Abydos thus became a double gate. It was a place where the myth of Osiris was eternally present, and it was a portal through which the dead, especially kings, could align themselves with this myth. Pilgrims believed that to be remembered in Abydos was to be remembered in eternity. Kings believed that to prepare one's vessel here was to ensure safe passage across the waters of death. But beyond the religious function, Abydos carried a profound psychological meaning. It reminded the living that death was not the end. It ritualized the most primal of human fears, the fear of annihilation, and transformed it into a promise of renewal. By tying human mortality to cosmic cycles, the Egyptians transfigured despair into hope, decay into resurrection. The boat was not merely wood and rope. It was a declaration of faith in the eternal river that carries all beings beyond the visible horizon. The architecture of Abydos reflects this spiritual weight. The temples, particularly the great temple of Seti-Tharan, were not built as mere shrines. They were maps of existence, layered with chapels dedicated to different gods, but all converging on Osiris, the axis of life and death. The walls carried inscriptions of processions and prayers, eternalizing in stone the rituals that guided the soul into eternity. Even the layout of the city reflected its symbolic role. The desert stretching westward into the land of the dead, the Nile flowing as the lifeblood of the living, and Abydos positioned as the hinge between them. It is no coincidence that Egyptians believed one could be reborn by association with this sacred site. Tomb inscriptions often invoked Abydos, even if the dead were buried elsewhere. To be tied to Abydos was to be tied to Osiris himself. This reveals something essential about the Egyptian view of the world. Death was not private, but cosmic. The fate of the individual soul was bound to the fate of the gods, and the gods were bound to cycles that transcended time itself. In Abydos, therefore, we see the fusion of myth, geography, and human longing. It was not just a religious center. It was an existential anchor, a reminder that human life is fragile, yes, but that fragility is itself part of an eternal rhythm. The buried boats, sleeping beneath the sand, were more than funerary offerings. They were testimonies to this faith, that the journey does not end at the grave but begins anew on a higher current of existence. And perhaps that is why Abydos still speaks to us today. Even across the distance of thousands of years, even stripped of its rituals and mysteries, the idea remains powerful, that there exists a place, whether in the desert, in the heart, or in the soul, where the worlds touch. A place where death loses its sting, because it is understood not as a fall into nothingness but as a passage into a greater voyage. Abydos is that place. It is the geography of hope. When archaeologists first brushed away the sands of Abydos and revealed the outlines of wooden planks, few could have imagined the magnitude of what they were seeing. These were not fragments of daily life, not fishing boats abandoned by chance, but immense vessels, carefully constructed, deliberately buried, and astonishingly well preserved by the desert. They lay in silence for nearly 5,000 years, hidden near the sacred precincts of Osiris, waiting to tell their story. The discovery began in the early 20th century, but it was in the 1990s that a team led by American archaeologists uncovered a fleet of 14 boats buried beside the funerary enclosure of Pharaoh Kusekemwe, a ruler of Egypt's second dynasty. Each boat, more than 20 meters long, had been dismantled into planks and carefully laid into long brick-lined pits, as if placed there not as refuse but as treasure. What purpose could they serve, buried so far from the waters of the Nile? The craftsmanship itself was stunning. The planks were made of imported cedar, likely from Lebanon, joined not by nails or metal, but by ropes threaded through mortises. This sewn boat technique was ancient even by Egyptian standards, a reminder of how early the Nile civilization mastered naval architecture. The boats were seaworthy, capable of carrying dozens of men, yet they were never used in battle or trade. Instead, they were interred in the sand, near the temples of Abydos, consecrated not to commerce but to eternity. One boat in particular became legendary, the so-called Abydos boat, reconstructed from its dismantled pieces. Measuring around 75 feet, it is one of the oldest known planked boats in human history. Its very existence rewrote the timeline of naval technology, proving that Egyptians were building complex wooden ships nearly 1,000 years earlier than previously believed. And yet, paradoxically, this technological marvel was buried, destined never to touch water again. Why? For the Egyptians, boats were more than vehicles. They were metaphors, microcosms of the journey of life and the passage into death. By burying boats at Abydos, pharaohs ensured they would have vessels ready for their journey with Osiris into the underworld. These were not toys or symbols. They were real ships, given as offerings and prepared for use in the world beyond. The desert itself became a harbor, and the pits, though dry and silent, became docks for eternity. The placement of the boats adds to the mystery. They were aligned near temples and funerary enclosures, positioned as if to accompany the pharaoh in ritual processions. Some scholars suggest they were used in ceremonial voyages during the king's life, perhaps to carry his image along the Nile during great festivals, and then ritually buried to continue serving him after death. Others believe they were never launched at all, built solely as spiritual instruments, never destined for earthly waters. The symbolism resonates with the solar boat of Khufu, discovered beside the Great Pyramid at Giza. That immense vessel, too, was buried in a pit, fully capable of sailing, yet meant for the pharaoh's soul to join the sun god Ra in his daily voyage across the heavens. Abydos, however, carried its own distinct meaning. Here the boats were not tied only to the sun's cycle, but to Osiris, the Lord of Resurrection. At Giza, the pharaoh sought to ascend with the sun. At Abydos, he sought to rise with the god of death and rebirth. Together, they reveal a civilization obsessed not with death as an end, but with navigation of eternity itself. What makes the Abydos boats particularly fascinating is their liminality. They blur the line between technology and ritual, between utility and symbol. They are masterpieces of engineering, yet their function transcends practicality. They remind us that in ancient Egypt, technology was not separate from spirituality. To build a boat was to craft a ritual, to shape wood into a vessel for the soul. The shipwright and the priest were engaged in the same act, preparing a passage across the river of death. Even the very act of burial held symbolic weight. To hide the boats in the desert was to mirror the myth of Osiris himself, whose body was dismembered and scattered, hidden across the land, only to be reassembled and resurrected. Just as Isis gathered the pieces of Osiris, so too might the king's soul gather the hidden vessels, reconstituting them in the afterlife for his great journey. The buried boat was a prophecy in wood, awaiting fulfillment beyond the grave. Today, fragments of these vessels rest in museums, their cedar planks worn but still resonant with meaning. To stand before them is to glimpse not only ancient craftsmanship, but an entire worldview. Each stitch of rope, each curve of timber, carries the weight of a civilization that saw life itself as a voyage. And as the modern eye looks upon these relics, a quiet question arises. Do we not still long for vessels of our own, ways to cross the unknown waters of existence? The archaeological mysteries of Abydos remind us that science and spirit are not enemies, but mirrors. The planks buried in the sand are both artifacts and metaphors. They are silent ships, yes, but also echoes of humanity's oldest intuition, that we are travelers, and that somewhere beyond the horizon, a greater sea awaits. To the eyes of the modern world, a pharaoh is often imagined as a ruler of stone and gold, enthroned amidst pyramids, wielding scepters, and surrounded by earthly power. But to the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was far more than a king of the Nile Valley. He was a cosmic voyager, a being whose life on earth was only the visible fraction of a much greater journey. His rule was a rehearsal, a preparation for the voyage beyond the veil of death. This vision was at the core of Egyptian kingship. The pharaoh was not merely Horus incarnate, the falcon god ruling the skies. He was also the heir of Osiris, destined to follow his path of death and resurrection. His body might rest in a tomb, but his spirit was expected to sail into the unseen worlds, navigating rivers of darkness and light, confronting serpents of chaos, and joining the eternal procession of the sun. To be a pharaoh was to live with one eye fixed on the beyond. The buried boats of Abydos reflect this deeper truth. They were not monuments to earthly glory, but preparations for a cosmic journey. Just as Ra sailed across the heavens in his solar bark, carrying light through the 12 gates of night before rising again at dawn, so too the pharaoh was destined to embark on his own voyage. Death was not an end, but an embarkation. The tomb was not a prison, but a harbor. The boat was not a symbol, but a vessel waiting for its divine passenger. In this light, every detail of the king's life was charged with cosmic meaning. His coronation was not only a political ceremony, but a ritual of alignment with divine order. His wars and conquests were seen as reflections of the eternal struggle of Horus against Set, of order against chaos. His building of temples and monuments was a way of anchoring cosmic truths into stone. And yet, beneath all these visible deeds, there was always the silent preparation, the construction of the vessel that would carry him beyond the horizon of mortal sight. To imagine the pharaoh as a cosmic voyager is to see him as a navigator of eternity. In the myths, he sails through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, facing trials and transformations, He meets guardians, demons, and gods. He battles the serpent Apophis, embodiment of chaos, just as Ra does each night. His heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth and order in the judgment hall of Osiris. And if found worthy, he rises renewed, not only as a soul but as a star, part of the celestial order that governs the universe. The boats of Abydos are therefore more than funerary offerings. They are maps of destiny. Each plank, each curve of wood speaks of a journey no eye could see, but every soul was destined to face. The pharaoh was the prototype, the one who journeyed first, blazing a trail for the people he ruled. His voyage was not private, but collective. If the king could rise, then Egypt itself was assured of renewal. The boat was not only his vehicle, it was the promise of continuity for the entire nation. What is striking is how the Egyptians refused to separate the material from the spiritual. To them, a cedar plank was not just wood, it was infused with divine purpose. The act of building a boat was simultaneously a ritual, an act of faith and a feat of engineering. By sailing through this life with wisdom and strength, the king proved himself worthy to sail into the next. The two journeys mirrored each other, earthly reign and cosmic voyage, Nile crossing and passage into the stars. We find echoes of this archetype across cultures, the shaman who journeys into the spirit world for his tribe, the hero who descends into the underworld in myth returning with wisdom or fire, the prophet who speaks of crossing rivers into promised lands. All carry the same intuition. Life is a journey, and death is the great sea that awaits. The pharaoh was Egypt's greatest voyager, and his boat was the blueprint of hope. To stand in Abydos, to look upon the pits where the boats were buried, is to be reminded of this vision. One can almost hear the silence of preparation, the stillness before embarkation. The sand becomes a shoreline, the desert a sea. In that vision, the pharaoh is not a distant monarch, but a mirror of our own destiny. For we too are voyagers. We too must prepare our vessels, not of cedar and rope, but of soul and spirit. This is why the image of the pharaoh as cosmic voyager still stirs something in the human heart. It awakens the ancient longing to know that death is not the end. It tells us that kings and commoners alike are bound to the same river, the same horizon. The difference is not in the destination, but in the preparation. To prepare a vessel, whether of wood or of wisdom, is to face eternity with courage. The pharaoh, then, was more than ruler. He was navigator. And the buried boats of Abydos were not relics of superstition, but testimonies to this greater truth, that human life is itself a voyage through visible and invisible worlds, and that the greatest act of kingship is to guide the soul across the eternal waters. When we pause to reflect on the boats of Abydos, it is tempting to see them as uniquely Egyptian, bound to Osiris, to the Nile, to the golden sands of the desert. And yet, the more we look across the tapestry of human cultures, the more we realize that Egypt was not alone. The idea of the boat as a vehicle of the soul, as the bridge between life and death, is a near universal archetype. It rises again and again in lands separated by oceans and centuries, as if humanity itself carried this symbol deep in its collective memory. Take the Vikings, for example. In the cold waters of the north, thousands of years after Abydos, the Norse laid their dead in boats and set them aflame or buried them beneath mounds shaped like ships. To the Norse mind, the soul was destined to travel beyond Midgard, across oceans of stars to Valhalla or the halls of the gods. The ship was not only a warrior's vessel in life, it was the sacred craft that carried him through death. The fire that consumed the boat on the waves was not destruction, but transformation, the release of the soul into the greater sea of eternity. In the Americas, the Maya spoke of Xibalba, the underworld, a realm reached only by crossing dangerous rivers and facing trials in darkness. The soul was thought to require guides or vessels to reach the next stage of existence. In their mythology, canoes appear as spiritual vehicles that carried the dead into the realms of gods and ancestors. The sacred journey was perilous, demanding not only strength, but preparation. Just as the Egyptians placed boats in the desert sands, the Maya imagined canoes gliding through waters invisible to the living. The Christian tradition, too, bears the echo. The church itself was often symbolized as a ship, the bark of Peter, carrying believers across the turbulent seas of life toward salvation. Early Christian art depicted the faithful as passengers on a vessel guided by Christ as captain. To step into the church was to board a ship bound for eternity. Even baptism, the rite of initiation, was often described in nautical terms, a passage through water, death, and rebirth. The Ark of Noah, carrying life through the flood, was not merely a story of survival but an image of the soul's passage through destruction into new creation. In Hindu cosmology, there is the story of Manu, the primordial man, who was warned of a coming flood. He built a great boat and was guided by the god Vishnu, who took the form of a fish, to safety across the cosmic waters. The tale is both mythic and spiritual. Humanity itself is carried through dissolution on a vessel of divine guidance. The boat becomes not only a means of survival but a symbol of preservation, of truth, of dharma, of the eternal order carried into new cycles of existence. Even in shamanic traditions, from Siberia to Polynesia, the image appears. Shamans often describe their spirit journeys as voyages across rivers or seas, traveling in boats made of light, bone, or imagination, to reach the lands of the dead or the realms of gods. These journeys were not metaphors to them, but lived realities of consciousness, passages that required preparation, courage, and spiritual vessels. Why does this archetype emerge again and again? Perhaps because humanity has always lived close to water, dependent on rivers, seas, and lakes for survival. The boat became the most primal symbol of movement, of transition, of crossing from one shore to another. And death, the greatest crossing of all, was naturally imagined in the same terms. To die was to leave one shore and arrive at another, and so the soul must have a vessel. But there is also a deeper psychological truth. To imagine the soul in a boat is to acknowledge both vulnerability and protection. A boat is fragile, easily overturned, yet it also carries us safely across waters that would otherwise drown us. The soul, like a boat, is small against the ocean of the unknown. Yet with the right vessel, whether of wood, ritual, or faith, it can survive the passage. The echoes across cultures remind us that Abydos was not an isolated vision, but part of a larger human story. From the cedar planks of Egypt to the burning ships of the north, from the canoes of the Maya to the Ark of Noah, humanity has again and again chosen the boat to represent the soul's voyage. It is as if, beneath all differences of language and myth, we share a single intuition. Life is a river, death is a crossing, and the soul is a passenger in search of the eternal shore. The boats of Abydos, then, are not relics only of Egypt. They are mirrors of humanity itself. They remind us that across the world, in temples and sagas, in rituals and dreams, we have always built vessels for the unseen journey. And perhaps in doing so we have been building the same vessel, a universal ark of the human spirit, carrying us through the floods of mortality toward the mystery that waits beyond. If Abydos was the city of Osiris, then it was not only a place of worship, but a vault of mysteries. To the casual eye, the temples were grand structures of stone, their walls carved with processions and prayers. To the pilgrim, they were sacred ground where the cycle of death and rebirth was ritually reenacted. But to the initiate, Abydos was more than sacred architecture. It was a living manual of resurrection, encoded in ritual, myth, and symbol. The Egyptians did not speak openly of their deepest truths. Much of their wisdom was veiled, reserved for those prepared to enter the mysteries. Abydos was the beating heart of these mysteries. Each year, dramatic rituals unfolded here, reenacting the death of Osiris, the mourning of Isis, the gathering of his scattered limbs, and his resurrection as Lord of the underworld. For the common people, these rituals were pageantry, a reassurance that life conquered death. For initiates, they were more. keys to understanding how the soul itself could survive the passage of death and rise renewed. The buried boats belonged to this hidden layer of meaning. To most, they were vessels for the pharaoh's afterlife. But to the priests and initiates, they were also symbols of an inner journey. The physical boat was a mirror of the spiritual vessel one must build within. Just as the planks were joined with rope, so too the elements of the human being, body, heart, mind, and spirit, had to be woven together into unity. Without such a vessel, the soul would be scattered like the body of Osiris, lost in the waters of the underworld. With it, the soul could sail safely into resurrection. Abydos taught that resurrection was not an automatic gift, but a process of alignment. To be reborn, one had to harmonize with Ma'at, the principle of truth and order. The judgment of the heart against the feather was not a superstition. It was a profound spiritual law. A heart heavy with falsehood, cruelty, or disorder could not rise. Only a heart made light through truth, compassion, and balance could ascend. In this sense, the boats of Abydos were not merely wooden artifacts. They were moral technologies, reminders that the journey of the soul depends on the life one has lived. The hidden knowledge of Abydos also pointed toward transformation. The initiate who entered its sanctuaries did not come out unchanged. The architecture itself was designed as a journey. The Temple of Seti Refern, for instance, unfolds in chambers that move progressively inward, drawing the pilgrim from the light of the outer world into the darkness of the inner sanctum, where the mysteries of Osiris were revealed. It was less a building than a map of the soul's path, from life, through death, into rebirth. This pattern echoes in the very landscape. The Nile, symbol of life, flows beside Abydos. The desert, symbol of death, stretches beyond it. And in between stands the temple, the threshold of resurrection. To walk from river to temple to desert was to live the myth in one's body. To bury boats in the sand was to affirm that the desert itself concealed a hidden sea, one only the soul could navigate. The wisdom encoded here is not limited to ancient Egypt. The idea that the soul must be prepared, that resurrection is a process of inner alignment, appears again in later traditions. The Christian gospel speaks of dying to the old self, to rise in the new. The Gnostics taught of the soul's ascent through cosmic spheres guided by secret knowledge. The Hermetic writings, born in Hellenistic Egypt centuries later, spoke of the rebirth of the soul through gnosis, the awakening of divine light within. All these echoes suggest that Abydos was not just an Egyptian cult site, but one of humanity's earliest laboratories of immortality. To stand in Abydos, then, is to stand at a crossroads of the human spirit. The boats in the sand are silent, yet they speak of a technology beyond wood and rope, the technology of resurrection. They remind us that the Egyptians were not obsessed with death, as is often claimed, but with continuity, with the possibility that life flows beyond endings. Their rituals, their temples, their buried ships, all were dedicated to the same conviction, that death is a passage and resurrection is possible. And perhaps this is the true hidden knowledge of Abydos. Not that the pharaoh alone could rise, borne by cedar ships and royal rites, but that every soul carries within it the potential for resurrection. The boat outside is only a reflection of the boat within. To build that vessel is to live truthfully, to weave together the scattered pieces of one's being, to make the heart light enough to rise. The desert still holds its secrets, and much of what was enacted in Abydos remains veiled. But the essence is clear. Abydos whispers a truth the human spirit has always known, that we are more than bodies, more than dust, that there is a river we cannot see, and that within us lies the vessel to cross it. When we step back from Abydos and the boats buried in its sands, we begin to glimpse something larger than Egypt, larger even than myth. We see the outline of an archetype, an image so deeply woven into the human psyche that it appears again and again across cultures, ages, and imaginations. This is the archetype of the vessel, the ship, the ark, the womb, the container that carries life across the waters of uncertainty. In Jungian psychology, archetypes are primordial patterns of thought and imagination, structures that shape the way humans everywhere interpret existence. The boat is one of these. It is not just a tool for transport, but a symbol of transformation. It represents safety in vulnerability, direction in chaos, continuity in the face of dissolution. When the world floods, when the sea threatens to overwhelm, it is the vessel that makes survival, and even rebirth, possible. We see this clearly in the story of Noah's Ark. Though told in the language of Israelite scripture, its imagery echoes the universal symbol. A world destroyed by water, humanity preserved in a vessel, life carried across chaos into a new beginning. The Ark is not only a story of survival but an archetype of spiritual passage. To enter the Ark is to enter a womb of protection, to die to the old world and emerge into the new. Abydos, with its boats of resurrection, speaks the same language. The Pharaoh, like Noah, must enter the vessel to survive the cosmic flood of death and rise into a renewed existence. The Argo of Greek mythology carries similar weight. Built under the guidance of the goddess Athena, it bore Jason and his companions across seas of danger in search of the Golden Fleece. The Argo was not only a ship, but a vessel of destiny, carrying heroes into trials that would shape their fate. Its timbers, infused with divine power, even spoke with a voice of prophecy. Here again, the boat becomes more than wood. It becomes a living archetype of the soul's voyage. Even outside mythology, the image persists. In the womb, the human being floats in amniotic waters, carried within the mother as in a vessel. Birth itself is a passage from one world into another, and the womb is the first ark, the first boat. Perhaps this is why the archetype resonates so deeply. We have all experienced it. Before we knew words, we were passengers in a vessel, carried safely through waters we could not navigate ourselves. The memory of this primal crossing may echo in every cultural image of the soul's boat. The archetype extends into the future as well. In our modern age, we dream of starships carrying humanity across the void of space. Science fiction is filled with arks that preserve life through cosmic catastrophe, vessels that journey across galaxies to carry humanity into new worlds. Though the materials are metal and technology, the pattern is the same. Life preserved in a vessel, carried through the unknown, reborn on a distant shore. Our imagination of the future is still shaped by the same archetype that guided the priests of Abydos. This universality suggests something profound, that the boat, the vessel, is not only a cultural artifact, but a deep structure of the human spirit. It speaks to our shared awareness that life is fragile, that we are surrounded by forces greater than ourselves, and that survival depends on more than strength. It depends on having something that carries us, whether faith, community, knowledge, or ritual. The vessel is whatever allows us to cross. At Abydos, the buried boats fulfilled this role for the Pharaoh. In the Bible, the Ark fulfilled it for Noah. In the myths of Greece, the Argo fulfilled it for heroes. In the inner world of psychology, the womb fulfills it for each of us. Again and again, the archetype appears, a container of safety, a bridge through chaos, a promise that what is fragile can endure. Perhaps this is why the archetype of the vessel remains so powerful today. In times of crisis, we still speak of finding a lifeboat, of needing an ark, of building a ship to carry us through. Even if we no longer bury boats in the desert, we build vessels of another kind. Philosophies, spiritual practices, scientific endeavors, each in its own way, is an attempt to navigate the great waters of existence. Each is a boat upon which the human spirit sails. The boats of Abydos are thus more than Egyptian relics. They are part of this universal archetype. They remind us that humanity has always intuited the same truth. We are travelers, fragile against the vastness of the unknown, yet capable of building vessels, inner and outer, that carry us forward. The wood of cedar, the arks of myth, the starships of our imagination, all are variations of the same eternal form. And so, when we gaze upon the pits of Abydos, where boats once lay hidden, we are not only looking into the past, we are looking into a mirror of ourselves. For we too must build our vessels. We too must prepare for the crossing. Not only the crossing of death, but the countless crossings of life. From childhood to adulthood, from ignorance to wisdom, from despair to hope. Each crossing requires a vessel, and each vessel is an echo of that universal archetype carried in the human soul. In the silence of the desert, where wind sweeps across the dunes and the Nile glimmers in the distance, the buried boats of Abydos whisper their message. They remind us that Egypt was not a civilization obsessed with death, but with continuity, with the possibility that life could flow beyond the horizon of endings. They remind us that kings were not only rulers of stone and gold, but voyagers of eternity, preparing vessels for a journey no eye could see, yet every heart must one day take. To the Egyptians, the boat was more than an invention of wood and rope. It was a sacred mirror of existence itself, a container of hope, a bridge between the visible and invisible. In the myths, Ra sailed his solar bark through the sky, Osiris sailed the hidden waters of the underworld, and the Pharaoh, in death, sailed with them both. The boats of Abydos, laid to rest in the desert sands, were vessels not of the Nile, but of the soul, yet their significance does not end in antiquity. For when we trace the archetype of the vessel across cultures, Viking ships set aflame on the northern seas, canoes guiding Maya souls through Xibalba, the Ark of Noah carrying life through cosmic flood, the womb that carried us all across the waters of birth, we see that the Egyptians were articulating a truth far older and more universal. Humanity has always known that we are travelers, that life itself is a voyage, and that death is not an abyss, but a crossing. Abydos gave this truth a form in cedar and sand. It wove myth, ritual, and architecture into a technology of resurrection. It taught that to rise again, one must build the inner vessel, to make the heart light with truth, to weave the fragments of the self into wholeness, to prepare the soul to sail. And though millennia have passed, the wisdom still stands. The boat is within us. The crossing awaits. To walk through Abydos today is to feel this resonance. The ruined walls of Seti's temple, the worn stones, the desert pits where boats once lay, all still vibrate with the same mystery. Pilgrims no longer gather, rituals no longer unfold, yet the air is thick with a presence beyond history. It is the presence of a place where worlds touch, where the visible opens into the invisible, where the eternal river calls to every soul. The boats of resurrection remind us that life is fragile, but it is also eternal. They remind us that the soul is not abandoned in death, but invited to voyage further. And they remind us that humanity's greatest monuments are not only pyramids or temples, but the symbols we carry within, symbols that still guide us, across millennia, toward the mystery of who we are. And so Abydos does not end in silence. Its story flows beyond the Nile, into our own lives, our own deaths, our own resurrections. It calls us to ask, what vessels are we building? What boats will carry us across our own rivers of transformation? Are we weaving lives of truth so that our hearts may be light enough to rise? This is the legacy of Abydos, a reminder, not only for kings, but for all who live and all who die, that the journey continues, that the river does not stop at the horizon, but opens into greater seas, that beyond the Nile, another voyage awaits. And as we leave Abydos behind, the desert still holds other secrets. Not far from here, colossal fortresses once stood, guardians of Egypt's frontiers, symbols not of resurrection but of defense, not of the soul's voyage, but of the empire's survival. If the boats of Abydos carried kings into eternity, these fortresses guarded their power upon the earth. Together, they formed two halves of Egypt's vision, the eternal voyage of the spirit and the temporal struggle to protect the land of gold. In our next exploration, we will journey into these fortresses of the Nile and uncover how stone and sand became Egypt's shield against chaos, and how the defense of empire mirrored the defense of the soul. For now, as we close the gates of Abydos, let us remember, The boat waits within us, the river calls, and the voyage is eternal. If you felt the call of Abydos and its boats of resurrection, consider joining this journey further. Like, share, and subscribe to Mystic Atlas, so that together we can keep uncovering the wisdom that still sleeps beneath the sands of time. And don't miss the next voyage of the fortresses of the Nile, where we uncover the earthly guardians of eternity.